Julian, your current position is remarkably stable. The compensation structure accurately reflects that stability. It was exactly 10:15 in the morning when Sandra firmly delivered those carefully chosen words. I remember the exact time because I instinctively looked at the digital clock on the wall the very moment the hollow words landed. There is something profoundly infuriating about hearing the exact same carefully rehearsed corporate answer for the fourth consecutive year in a row that forces you to pay absolute attention to the minutest details. We were currently sitting inside one of those aggressively modern glass-walled conference rooms that Horizon Data Solutions love to build. The pristine table was completely clean, the neutral gray chairs were impeccably aligned, and absolutely everything in the room was meticulously designed to feel incredibly calm and perfectly controlled. Sitting directly across the expansive table from me was Sandra, the senior director from Human Resources. She maintained a perfectly calm voice and absolutely flawless posture throughout the entire frustrating exchange. Seated comfortably to her immediate right was Oliver, my newly appointed department manager. Oliver was a fresh-faced graduate in his early 30s, proudly holding a recent business degree and wearing a remarkably sharp, incredibly expensive tailored suit. He was exactly the kind of ambitious corporate climber who always spoke exceptionally well during high-stakes leadership meetings, but who never actually stayed long enough in any single department to genuinely understand or fundamentally fix anything that was broken. He steadfastly refused to look directly at me when Sandra delivered the final verdict. "Your role is stable." I had been constantly hearing that exact infuriating phrase for 4 incredibly long, incredibly exhausting years. Stable, they said it casually, acting exactly as if the incredibly complex digital systems I personally kept running seamlessly every single day were not solely responsible for holding together massive logistics contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. They spoke as if the frantic clients constantly calling my personal mobile phone at midnight did not actually exist. They treated stability as if it were something remarkably simple, something entirely basic that absolutely anyone off the street could easily maintain with minimal effort. Sandra slowly and deliberately slid a crisp white sheet of paper across the polished surface of the table. My current annual salary was printed clearly in bold black ink. It was the exact same number as last year. "We extensively reviewed the current market data," Sandra continued smoothly, her tone completely devoid of any genuine empathy, "and based specifically on your current position and operational duties, we feel this compensation is perfectly aligned." Aligned. I almost nodded my head in disbelief. That is the truly strange, somewhat surreal part of these meticulously scripted corporate interactions. You sit there in the painfully quiet room, and for a brief, fleeting second, you almost find yourself agreeing with their distorted logic. Their tone is so incredibly calm, so thoroughly confident, acting as if the final decision was firmly made somewhere incredibly high above you in the corporate hierarchy, entirely finalized long before you ever walked through the heavy glass doors into the room. I leaned back slightly in my comfortable chair. I have consistently taken on significantly more operational responsibility over the past 48 months, I said calmly, ensuring my voice remained perfectly measured. I currently handle advanced system oversight, complex client escalation procedures, and extensive weekend coverage that nobody else on the entire team is technically capable of managing. Oliver finally decided to speak up, though he still avoided making direct eye contact. "And we genuinely appreciate all of that hard work, Julian. We really do appreciate your dedication," he offered, his words sounding distinctly hollow and heavily rehearsed. "But comprehensive compensation isn't just about your daily workload," he added smoothly. "It is fundamentally about our broader organizational structure." Structure. There was that completely meaningless corporate buzzword again. I had personally endured absolutely every conceivable version of this incredibly frustrating conversation. I sat there in profound silence for several long seconds, absolutely refusing to argue, not pushing back aggressively, simply letting the heavy reality of the situation completely settle in the quiet room. Because at a certain definitive point in your career, you simply stop trying to desperately convince unyielding people who have already firmly made up their stubborn minds. My name is Julian Vance. I am 54 years old, and at that specific moment in my life, I had dedicated 18 exhaustive years working deep inside the technical trenches of Horizon Data Solutions. I was officially their senior systems operations manager, but in reality, I was the sole individual people desperately called when massive digital infrastructures completely failed. I was the reliable person who always stayed late in the dark office when absolutely everyone else happily went home. Sandra slowly and carefully closed the manila folder resting on the table in front of herself. We can absolutely revisit this specific compensation discussion next year, Julian. Next year. I almost allowed a bitter smile to crack across my face at that utterly predictable statement. 4 consecutive years in a row, and somehow the vague promise of next year always sounded like a genuine, realistic possibility when they confidently delivered the well-worn script. Oliver finally looked up from his perfectly manicured hands, just for a brief, fleeting second. We really want you to stay with us, Julian. You are an important part of the operations team. Important. Not immensely valuable, not absolutely critical to the company's survival, just important. I nodded my head exactly once. The motion was slow, deliberate, and perfectly controlled. Understood, I replied calmly. I slowly stood up from the comfortable chair, carefully adjusted the collar of my jacket, and politely thanked them both for their valuable time. I remained perfectly polite and flawlessly professional. I behaved exactly the way they fully expected someone in my specific, severely undervalued position to respond. Because that is an undeniable part of the demanding role, too. It is never just about expertly fixing broken server systems. It is also about carefully managing executive perception. As I quietly walked out of the glass-walled room, I briefly caught my own reflection in the transparent door. I maintained the exact same strong posture and the exact same calm, unbothered expression on my face. Looking at me, you would absolutely never know that something monumental had just fundamentally shifted inside my mind, but it undeniably had. I slowly sat down in my chair and pulled up the primary operations dashboard on my large central monitor. Everything was displaying perfectly green, remarkably clean, and seemingly normal. But I knew far better than to trust the basic corporate overview. There were always small, insidious delays, tiny timing mismatches, and fragmented data queues building quietly in the hidden background. Nothing was quite big enough to trigger the automated alarms just yet. But there was more than enough hidden friction to become a massive, catastrophic problem if I chose to ignore it. I carefully opened a secondary diagnostic panel, and then quickly opened a third one. That is where the genuine, heavily complex work truly existed. It was the crucial, immensely demanding part of my daily routine that absolutely no one had ever bothered to write into my official job description. Over my 18 lengthy years at Horizon Data Solutions, I had painstakingly built most of those advanced monitoring layers myself. They were highly sophisticated, remarkably effective custom tools designed specifically to proactively identify deep systemic issues long before they surfaced on any executive's radar. Because the official corporate software only ever showed you what had already catastrophically failed, my custom tools allowed me to focus intensely on exactly what was about to break. Around 11:30 in the morning, my mobile phone suddenly buzzed violently on my desk. It was an urgent client escalation from Hector, the regional director at Apex Logistics. They were one of our largest, most lucrative external accounts. They weren't our absolute biggest client, but they were incredibly close, representing a massive portion of our quarterly revenue, and any delay was disastrous. Hector quickly explained that they were currently experiencing troubling delays in their primary processing queues. It was nothing absolutely critical just yet, but it was certainly enough to raise a significant amount of immediate concern. I answered the ringing phone on the second ring. "Julian speaking," I said smoothly. I could instantly hear the profound relief on the other end of the line. "Julian, thank God, we are seeing some really weird inconsistencies in yesterday's batch data," Hector explained rapidly. "I will personally take a look at it right now," I promised calmly. I didn't schedule an unnecessary meeting. I didn't open a lengthy support ticket. I completely bypassed the bureaucratic escalation chain. It was just me, handling the crisis directly. That was exactly how my days usually worked. I rapidly pulled their encrypted data logs. I swiftly traced the complex issue back to a tiny timing offset hidden deep within one of our internal routing processes. It was a remarkably small, seemingly insignificant error that was incredibly easy to completely miss if you didn't know exactly where to look. "Give me about 10 minutes," I confidently told Hector. I completely resolved the complex digital issue in exactly 7 minutes. By the time we finally ended the call, absolutely everything was perfectly back to normal. There was no official incident report filed. There was no permanent record of the near disaster. Absolutely no one else in the entire company even knew that the critical event had occurred. That was the relentless, exhausting daily pattern. Every single day, I quietly solved massive, incredibly complex problems long before they ever reached the surface. Meanwhile, high above me on the executive floors, ambitious people like Oliver were busy preparing fancy presentations. Oliver was exceptionally good at making presentations. He clearly knew how to confidently speak in clean, persuasive sentences. He utilized incredibly clear, highly polished slides to construct simple, reassuring narratives for the board. Improved efficiency, stable performance, exceptional operational strength. I had personally seen several of those slick executive decks over the years. Sometimes I would even recognize the direct, undeniable results of my own grueling midnight labor prominently displayed on his colorful charts. The only thing conspicuously missing was my name. Around mid-afternoon, I quietly walked past one of the large executive conference rooms. Oliver was standing inside, confidently presenting his latest quarterly findings to the senior leadership team. I didn't bother to go inside the room. I already knew exactly what hollow promises were being confidently spoken. Metrics, exponential growth, unwavering stability. It was all technically true, yet entirely incomplete. Because absolutely none of those polished slides ever accurately explained just how incredibly close the fragile systems constantly came to completely breaking apart, or exactly who tirelessly kept them from reaching that catastrophic point. That messy, complicated reality didn't neatly fit into their pristine corporate slides, and over my lengthy, exhausting tenure, I had eventually stopped trying to desperately force them to understand it. It wasn't bitter resentment that filled me. It was pure, unadulterated clarity. I knew exactly what I accomplished every day. I knew exactly what the delicate systems desperately needed to survive. And I knew exactly what would inevitably happen if my deep, specialized understanding completely disappeared. The catastrophic failure wouldn't happen immediately, but it would absolutely happen eventually. That is the fundamental, undeniable truth about massive, complex digital networks like ours. They absolutely never fail all at once in a spectacular explosion. Instead, they slowly drift. Small, seemingly insignificant gaps appear. Tiny, unnoticed processing delays begin to accumulate. Minor, unrecorded data errors begin to silently stack up in the background. Until one fateful day, all those incredibly small, ignored issues finally connect. And then the massive, systemic collapse feels incredibly sudden and completely shocking to everyone involved, even though it was never truly sudden at all. I slowly leaned back in my comfortable desk chair and quietly looked at my glowing monitor once again. Everything was still perfectly green. Everything was still perfectly stable on paper. It wasn't my meager corporate title. It absolutely wasn't my stagnant annual salary. My true value was the profound understanding and the absolute trust that inherently came with it. Powerful clients like Hector didn't blindly ask for the operations department when things went wrong. They specifically asked for me. Not because I was inherently special, but because I was incredibly consistent, remarkably reliable, and perfectly predictable under extreme pressure. That rare consistency matters far more than most corporate executives ever realize, especially when you are actively managing delicate systems that continuously carry millions of dollars in live revenue. By the time my long workday finally ended, absolutely everything was still running smoothly. There were no major systemic issues, zero visible operational problems, just another perfectly stable, perfectly quiet day. That is exactly what management proudly saw. What management completely failed to see was the immense, exhausting amount of undocumented work it continuously took to keep it exactly that way. or how incredibly quickly that much-celebrated stability could completely disappear if the wrong minor issues were arrogantly ignored. I slowly shut down my dual monitors. For 18 long years, I had taken immense personal pride in being the reliable anchor, being the one dedicated person who kept absolutely everything securely together. But that specific day, directly following that incredibly insulting meeting with Sandra and Oliver, something deep inside me felt fundamentally different. I didn't feel broken. I just felt incredibly clear, almost as if I was finally seeing my exhausting role exactly the same way they blindly did. I realized I was entirely replaceable in their arrogant eyes. I honestly started wondering what would inevitably happen to their precious company if I simply stopped aggressively proving them wrong. I remembered the eager new hires like Toby. Toby was a remarkably smart, incredibly quick learner who had recently graduated with a shiny new business degree. Oliver enthusiastically liked Toby almost immediately, placing him in high-level executive meetings incredibly early in his tenure, giving him massive corporate visibility, and frequently letting him proudly present my complex operational updates directly to the senior leadership team. I had personally trained Toby for months. I carefully showed him exactly where the real, undocumented systemic issues were hidden, deep within the code. I taught him how to accurately read the raw server data, far beyond what the simplistic executive dashboards displayed. Toby listened, but he never truly understood. That evening, I did something I had never done before. I opened my personal, highly secured laptop that I always kept meticulously separated from the corporate network. On that personal machine, completely isolated from Horizon Data Solutions, lived the vast, intricate ecosystem of custom monitoring software I had painstakingly coded entirely on my own time over the weekends. The corporate systems were clunky, outdated, and frankly, completely useless for proactive monitoring. Because they refused to invest in proper infrastructure, I had personally written thousands of lines of advanced Python and C++ code to silently monitor their massive data streams. I had always let the company passively benefit from my custom tools without ever explicitly signing over the legal ownership. In fact, deep within the primary executable file, I had explicitly embedded a legal copyright notice. As I stared at the blinking cursor, my mind naturally drifted toward Title 17 of the United States Code, specifically Section 106, the bedrock of federal copyright law. According to Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, the owner of a copyright has the exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, and perform the copyrighted work. I had never signed any intellectual property assignment agreement that covered software developed exclusively on my personal devices outside of official corporate working hours. Horizon Data Solutions didn't legally own my powerful monitoring architecture. I did. I had essentially been granting them an informal, entirely unwritten, and legally revocable license to utilize my proprietary software for the past 4 years completely free of charge. And now they had confidently decided my unique contributions were simply stable and unworthy of a raise. The realization hit me like a massive wave of cold water. I wasn't trapped. I was holding the absolute keys to their entire kingdom, and they were completely oblivious. The very next morning, I walked into the bustling office with a profound sense of calm that I hadn't felt in nearly a decade. I didn't abruptly quit. I simply started doing exactly what my official job description explicitly demanded, and absolutely nothing more. When the automated alarm softly chimed at 3:30 in the morning, indicating a massive data backlog in the logistics queue, I simply rolled over in my bed and went back to sleep. For 18 years, I would have frantically logged in and silently fixed it. But that night, I let the fragile system run its natural, disastrous course. The corporate fallout was incredibly swift and absolutely chaotic. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the executive floor was in a state of sheer panic. The massive data backlog had cascaded into the primary billing servers, completely halting tens of millions of dollars in scheduled transactions. I walked into the office to find Oliver frantically pacing back and forth near my desk, his expensive suit looking significantly less sharp than usual. "Julian, we have a catastrophic failure in the primary routing hub," he gasped out, his eyes wide with genuine fear. The automated alerts didn't trigger until it was far too late. Do you know what happened? I looked at him with an incredibly calm, perfectly neutral expression. I am currently reviewing the standard operating procedures, Oliver. I will submit a detailed diagnostic ticket shortly. Oliver literally stopped breathing for a few agonizing seconds. His mouth opened and closed silently, completely unable to process the dense legal terminology I had just weaponized against him. What exactly are you discussing? He finally sputtered, his voice cracking noticeably. You work for us. We own everything you do. I slowly shook my head. No. Oliver, you own the work outlined in my official job description. You explicitly do not own my personal intellectual property. And since my role is entirely stable and perfectly aligned, I will no longer be providing millions of dollars of free software infrastructure to desperately compensate for the company's massive technical incompetence. I stood up slowly, picked up my personal laptop, and calmly walked out of the chaotic office, leaving Oliver standing there in absolute terrified silence. I officially submitted my formal resignation precisely 2 hours later, ensuring that Sandra and Human Resources received a legally certified copy along with a formal cease and desist letter explicitly outlining my rights under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. The letter demanded the immediate and permanent cessation of any unauthorized use of my proprietary monitoring software. The impact of my sudden departure was absolutely devastating. Without my custom software constantly predicting and mitigating the underlying flaws, the massive corporate network began to completely unravel. Small, minor errors that I used to silently fix in seconds rapidly ballooned into massive, catastrophic failures. The client escalations didn't just double, they multiplied exponentially. Hector from Apex Logistics was one of the very first major clients to aggressively demand a formal explanation for the sudden, massive drop in reliability. The very first frantic message came exactly 3 days after I permanently left the building, and it wasn't from senior management. It was from a junior technician I used to occasionally work with on the chaotic operations floor. A quick, desperate question. Julian, are you still reachable? I stared at the brief message on my phone screen for a long, quiet second before finally replying. What's going on? There was a noticeably long delay before he typed back. We are seeing some incredibly massive delays in the primary batch processing. It isn't just a minor glitch. Things are completely stopping. I instantly knew exactly what that meant. What kind of delays specifically? I calmly asked. He frantically explained the chaotic situation, massive timing issues, catastrophic mismatches between the primary servers, and totally corrupted data logs. I could clearly see the exact architectural problem in my head long before he even finished typing the frantic message. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't know how to instantly fix it, but simply because I wasn't there anymore, and it was no longer my responsibility. Have you carefully checked the synchronization intervals on the secondary server? I finally asked. Yeah, Toby checked them, and they look totally fine on his dashboard, he replied. Of course they did. On the simplistic corporate dashboards, absolutely everything always looked perfectly fine until the entire system completely crashed. All right, I typed back calmly. Just keep closely monitoring it. That was absolutely it. There was no deep dive into the terminal, no heroic stepping in to save them, just cold, professional distance. Over the next few chaotic days, I heard significantly more troubling rumors. They weren't official announcements, just quiet, panicked messages, frantic questions, and massive internal concerns. The exact kind of complex issues that used to confidently come directly to me long before they ever became highly visible problems. Now they were slowly moving through the rigid corporate system, moving much slower, and becoming incredibly uncertain. From what I heard through the grapevine, young Toby tried to aggressively manage the escalating crisis through formal structure, endless meetings, constant updates, and rigid status reports. From his extremely limited perspective, he was handling the situation exactly as Oliver had taught him. Tracking the massive issues, assigning urgent tasks, and blindly following the broken corporate process. But the fragile system absolutely wasn't built to be managed that way. Hector from Apex Logistics explicitly asked Oliver, "Is something fundamentally different on your end?" That specific, highly pointed question matters infinitely more than any colorful quarterly report. Because once a major client physically feels a negative difference, it means the underlying system has already completely changed. And once they start asking those tough questions, they start watching every single transaction incredibly closely. I stayed perfectly quiet, deeply focused on transitioning into a significantly better phase of my career. And for the very first time in nearly 2 decades, I wasn't the invisible person desperately holding a collapsing infrastructure together behind the scenes. It felt remarkably lighter, not necessarily easier, but undeniably clearer. Even from a comfortable distance, I could easily see exactly what was happening to them. Not because I was actively involved, but because I had personally seen the exact same dangerous pattern far too many times, just never entirely all at once. Horizon Data Solutions still foolishly believed the crisis was entirely manageable. From their arrogant perspective, nothing had permanently failed yet. There were no massive public outages, no lost contracts, just a series of small, incredibly annoying issues. And small issues are incredibly easy to arrogantly ignore until they suddenly become completely unmanageable, because delicate systems like that don't break loudly. They drift helplessly, and once they start aggressively drifting without someone proactively correcting them early, the disastrous direction only goes one inevitable way. By the second chaotic week, the corporate tone completely changed. You could clearly hear the sheer panic in the forwarded messages. They were absolutely no longer casual technical questions. They were significantly sharper, much shorter, and incredibly urgent. What fundamentally changed? That specific, terrified question showed up in the logs more than once, not just from angry internal staff, but from furious external clients. That is exactly when I knew it had finally moved far past small operational issues. Because massive clients absolutely don't ask that unless something feels catastrophically wrong in a very real, tangible way. I absolutely didn't need to be inside the crumbling system to clearly understand exactly what was happening. The numerous processing delays weren't being corrected early anymore. They were aggressively stacking. Small server mismatches were rapidly turning into massive timing gaps. Those timing gaps were instantly turning into catastrophic processing errors, halting everything. The first truly devastating financial sign came directly from Apex Logistics. They were the highly lucrative account I used to personally support with my custom software. Hector didn't even make a formal announcement. He simply reduced their weekly processing volume quietly. A 10% drop at first, then significantly more. That is exactly how massive corporate clients react when they are unsure of your stability. They don't leave immediately. They slowly pull back, they cautiously test the waters, and they carefully watch the results. And if things absolutely don't improve rapidly, they completely move their millions to a competent competitor. I heard about the massive revenue drop through a former colleague I still deeply trusted. They are aggressively asking for legally binding stability guarantees now, he frantically told me over the phone. Inside Horizon Data Solutions, the senior leadership finally started noticing the catastrophic numbers. The weekly financial reports absolutely didn't look clean anymore. Profit margins were tightening drastically. Overall throughput was significantly lower across the board. Emergency executive meetings were immediately started. These weren't public departmental meetings. They were highly restricted, closed-door panic rooms, senior leadership only. Oliver was frequently in those tense meetings now. Toby, too. They desperately tried to logically explain exactly what was happening. They frantically tried to logically connect chaotic things that absolutely didn't make any sense on paper. Because on corporate paper, absolutely everything was still theoretically operational. The physical systems were running. The internal processes were supposedly active, but the financial outcomes were utterly disastrous, bleeding money everywhere. By midweek, a massive second client aggressively escalated their numerous complaints. They were significantly larger than Apex. They didn't just quietly reduce their processing volume. They legally questioned the entire core contract. They attacked the failing service levels and the complete lack of reliability. That is exactly when things get truly serious. Because once massive, multi-year contracts are legally questioned, corporate revenue isn't just slowly dropping. It is at massive existential risk. The final, utterly devastating number formally came in by the end of the incredibly chaotic week: 55%. That is exactly how much critical revenue had catastrophically dropped across the key technical accounts. 55% in just a matter of days. That doesn't happen because of one minor software failure. It happens because of accumulated weakness. That is exactly when my name started frequently coming up in the panicked executive meetings. At first, it was mentioned quietly, in hushed conversations, in desperate side comments. Julian used to smoothly handle this exact type of catastrophic failure. I think Julian had a highly effective workaround for something exactly like this. We really should carefully check what Julian extensively documented before he suddenly left us. Then the terrified questions became significantly louder, much more direct, and undeniably desperate. Why didn't we strategically plan for this massive contingency? Who officially owns this broken process now? Can we somehow convince him to come back? That last desperate question truly matters, because once it gets asked aloud by the CEO, it means they finally understand the massive gap in their arrogant logic. Not fully, but just enough to be terrified. I received the highly anticipated phone call late Friday evening. It was an unknown number flashing on my screen again, but this time I knew exactly where the desperate call was originating. I deliberately let the phone ring 3 times before finally answering. Julian speaking. There was absolutely no formal introduction, just a shaky, nervous breath on the other end of the line. Then a familiar, highly stressed voice spoke. It was the Vice President of Operations, Oliver's direct boss. He used a completely different tone than he ever had before. It was significantly less polished and far more real. "Julian, we desperately need to talk." Of course they did. I slowly leaned back in my comfortable chair. I was perfectly calm, entirely unsurprised, and just ready to quietly listen to them beg. "Julian, we are currently seeing some incredibly massive issues on the operations side." He started awkwardly. His voice was careful, heavily measured, almost as if he foolishly believed that if he chose the exact right words, it would somehow sound significantly smaller than it actually was. I didn't interrupt him. I let him continue his pathetic explanation. "It is absolutely nothing we can't eventually fix," he added far too quickly, entirely lying to himself. "But we could really use your unique technical insight to speed up the recovery process." Insight. That was a remarkably new corporate buzzword. Before I left, it was always structure, alignment, stability. Now it was insight. "What specific kind of technical issues are you discussing?" I calmly asked, even though I already knew the disastrous truth. He frantically explained the grim situation. Massive data delays, escalating client concerns, and catastrophic revenue impact. He absolutely didn't explicitly say 55%, but he certainly didn't have to explain. You could clearly hear the massive financial loss in the way he awkwardly paused between terrified sentences. "We would really like you to come in," he pleaded quietly. "Take a close look at the servers. Help us stabilize things before we lose Apex entirely." Stabilize. There was that infuriating word once again. I stood up and slowly walked over to the expansive window of my new home office. "What exactly are you formally asking me to do?" I asked, my voice completely flat. A long, agonizing pause followed. "Short-term consulting, just until we get things safely back on track. I'm going to be perfectly direct with you," I said calmly. "You had 4 long years to fairly adjust my compensation when I was successfully preventing these exact problems." Dead silence, no interruption. "You actively chose not to," I continued coldly. "That was your executive decision, and my custom software belongs to me, protected under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. You cannot afford the licensing fee." I hung up the phone. I never went back. They lost millions.